You check your phone, nothing. No texts, no missed calls, no one asking how your day went. You scroll through your contacts, 300 names, and not one of them feels like someone you could call right now, at this hour, with this ache in your chest. And somewhere in the silence, a thought arrives that you've tried to outrun for years. What is wrong with me? Here's what nobody tells you. The lack of friends doesn't mean what you think it means. It isn't proof that you're broken, unlikable, or destined to die alone in an apartment full of unread books. It might be the opposite. It might be the most honest signal you've ever received about who you actually are, and who you were never meant to become. Stay with me. By the end of this video, you won't just understand your solitude, you'll know exactly what to do with it. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the channel where ancient philosophy meets the very real, very modern problems that keep you up at night. No fluff, no motivational speaker theatrics, just the cold, clear thinking of men who buried friends, lost empires, and faced exile, and came out the other side with something more valuable than comfort, clarity. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, you know what's coming. Settle in. Let's start with the truth, because the Stoics never flinched from it. You are not imagining this. Loneliness has quietly become one of the defining conditions of modern life. People are more connected than any generation in human history, and somehow more isolated than ever. We have hundreds of contacts and no one to call. We have group chats that never get used for anything real. We perform friendship in photos and feel nothing underneath. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world during his lifetime, wrote in private journal, never meant for anyone else's eyes, about a different kind of isolation. Surrounded by senators, generals, servants, and family, he still confided to himself that the truest test of a man is what he does when no one is applauding him, when no one is even watching. He wasn't friendless in the way you might be, but he understood something that applies directly to you. The number of people around you was never the measure of anything that mattered. So, let's ask the real question, the one underneath the surface-level shame. Why does it feel so unbearable to be the one without a group, without a circle, without someone to tag in a meme at 2:00 a.m.? Because we've been sold a myth that human worth is measured in head count, that a full social calendar equals a full life, that if your phone isn't buzzing, you are, by definition, failing at being human. The Stoics would call this what it is, a false premise. And false premises produce false suffering. If you've ever sat in a room full of people and felt more alone than when you were by yourself, drop a comment below. I want to know. I'm not the only one who's lived that. Epictetus was born a slave, stripped of family, freedom, and any guarantee of human dignity. He later became one of the most influential philosophers in Rome, teaching senators and emperors in waiting the very lessons he had to learn in chains. He had a teaching that cut straight through the loneliness you're feeling right now, the dichotomy of control. Some things are within your power, your judgments, your choices, your character. Some things are not, other people's affection, their loyalty, whether they choose to stay in your life or quietly drift away. Here's the part that stings, and the part that frees you in the same breath. You cannot make people want to be your friend. You cannot force loyalty. You cannot manufacture connection out of people who are never going to choose you. So, when you sit alone on a Friday night scrolling through photos of people who didn't invite you, you are, without realizing it, trying to control the uncontrollable. You are grieving something that was never yours to keep in the first place. Epictetus would tell you this isn't cruelty. It's relief, because once you stop trying to control who likes you, you get your energy back, all of it. Every ounce you were spending trying to be palatable enough, interesting enough snorts for people who are never going to stay anyway. He had another phrase that modern psychology has only recently caught up to. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. The lack of friends is what happened to you. Maybe through circumstance, moving cities, growing apart, a slow fade nobody explained. Maybe through choice, yours or theirs. But how you interpret that fact, that's entirely yours to decide. You can interpret it as proof of unworthiness, or you can interpret it as the Stoics did, as an invitation into a relationship with yourself that you've been avoiding your whole life. Tell me in the comments, when was the last time you sat in true silence with no distractions, just you and your own thoughts? Be honest, most of us avoid it like a disease. Seneca wrote letter after letter to his friend Lucilius, proof, ironically, that even the philosopher of solitude valued real connection deeply. But Seneca drew a sharp, often misunderstood line between being alone and loneliness. He wrote that retreating into solitude was not punishment. It was preparation. A wise man, he said, withdraws into himself not to escape the world, but to meet himself fully without the noise of an audience shaping his every word and posture. Think about how differently you behave with a crowd versus by yourself. With people, you edit yourself in real time, softening opinions, laughing at jokes that aren't funny, agreeing with statements you don't believe. Alone, none of that performance is necessary. You finally get to find out who you are when nobody's grading the performance. Seneca believed most people are terrified of solitude precisely because of what it reveals. Without a crowd to perform for, you're left with your actual thoughts. And for many people, that confrontation is more frightening than any social rejection. This is the cruel irony of the friendless years. They are often the exact years a person needed most to become someone, before they had the right people to share that person with. Look at almost any biography of someone who built something extraordinary, an art form, a business, a body of knowledge, a transformed character. Trace it back far enough, and you'll almost always find a stretch of years that looked, from the outside, like failure. Few friends, no applause, no witnesses. What looked like absence was actually incubation. Seneca's advice wasn't to glorify isolation forever. It was to use it. He said the wise treat solitude as the gymnasium treats the body, a place to build strength nobody sees yet, so that when you finally re-enter the world, you enter as someone forged, not someone still waiting to be shaped by whoever happens to show up. So ask yourself honestly, in this season without a crowd around you, what are you building? What are you becoming when no one's there to perform for? If you're in a quiet season right now, not by choice, maybe tell me one thing you've learned about yourself that you never would have discovered with a packed social calendar. Here's a number that should disturb you more than it comforts you. Research on human relationships consistently finds that most people can only maintain a small handful of truly close relationships at once. Not dozens, not hundreds. The brain simply isn't built for deep intimacy at scale, which means that person you envy with 300 friends and a packed social calendar, statistically almost none of those 300 people would show up at 3:00 a.m. if their life fell apart. Most of them are acquaintances wearing the costume of friendship. The Stoics understood this intuitively centuries before anyone ran a study to prove it. Marcus Aurelius surrounded himself by necessity with senators and generals and advisors, and still wrote privately about the importance of choosing carefully who he let close enough to shape his character. He warned himself repeatedly about the corrupting influence of bad company, not because company itself was bad, but because the wrong company quietly reshapes you into someone you didn't choose to be. This is the part that should change how you see your own situation. If you have few friends, but the ones you do have are honest with you, loyal in private as well as public, and unafraid to tell you the truth when you're wrong, you are not poor. You are, by the actual mathematics of human connection, wealthy. And if you have no close friends right now, that is not a verdict on your worth. It is at most a temporary inventory problem. It says nothing permanent about your character, your likability, or your future. Compare two people. One has 50 acquaintances and 0 people who tell them an uncomfortable truth to their face. The other has one friend who would. Which person is actually equipped to navigate a hard year of their life? The Stoics would not hesitate in their answer. Drop a number in the comments. How many people in your life would actually tell you the truth even if it hurt? Don't overthink it. Most people's honest answer surprises them. Let's not romanticize this too far. Sometimes the lack of friends isn't a noble Stoic retreat into solitude. Sometimes it isn't evidence that you're simply different or above the crowd. And sometimes it has nothing to do, clears throat, with the world failing to understand you. More often than we'd like to admit, loneliness is shaped not only by circumstance, but by quiet patterns we've built over the years without ever noticing them. Perhaps you've learned to withdraw before anyone has the chance to reject you. Maybe you've convinced yourself that people always disappoint, so you leave first before they can leave you. Or perhaps you've built standards so impossibly high that no human being could ever meet them, then called the disappointment discernment. There are also those who mistake cynicism for wisdom, believing that expecting the worst is the same thing as seeing reality clearly. But wisdom is not the absence of hope. It is the ability to see clearly without allowing fear to become your identity. The Stoics never encouraged this kind of self-deception. They never asked you to hide behind philosophical language while avoiding uncomfortable truths. In fact, the entire Stoic discipline begins with ruthless self-examination. Before judging the world, you examine yourself. Before blaming circumstances, you ask what part of the situation belongs to you. Marcus Aurelius practiced this every single day. Each morning, he reminded himself that he would meet difficult, impatient, selfish, and ungrateful people. But notice something important: he wasn't preparing excuses to avoid them. He wasn't convincing himself that humanity was hopeless. He was preparing his own character so that, regardless of how others behaved, he would respond with patience, justice, self-control, and calm. His focus was never on changing people. It was on becoming the kind of person who could remain steady among them. So here's an uncomfortable but deeply necessary question. If you genuinely desire meaningful connection and it never seems to arrive, is it possible that fear, not fate, has been quietly shaping your life? Fear of being a burden, fear of reaching out first, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of looking too eager, fear that your kindness won't be returned, fear that vulnerability will be met with same silence, indifference, or rejection you've experienced before. These fears rarely announce themselves. They disguise themselves as independence. They whisper that you're simply protecting your peace. They convince you that you don't need anyone. Yet, often beneath that mask of self-sufficiency is someone who longs to be understood, but has forgotten how to risk being seen. Epictetus would remind you that the discomfort of risking rejection belongs entirely within your power to face, even though the outcome never does. You cannot control whether someone answers your message. You cannot control whether an invitation is accepted. You cannot control whether another person values your presence, but you absolutely control whether you choose courage instead of avoidance. You control whether you send the message, whether you smile first, whether you introduce yourself, whether you forgive, whether you remain open instead of closing another door before anyone has the chance to knock. This is where Stoicism stops being a comforting philosophy and becomes a demanding one. It refuses to let you hide behind elegant ideas while remaining trapped inside old habits. It does not ask you to accept loneliness passively, decorating it with philosophical quotes while taking no meaningful action. Instead, it asks you to distinguish between what is yours to influence and what never was. Act where action is possible, accept only what truly lies beyond your control, and perhaps that's the hardest lesson of all. Because blaming fate is easier than confronting fear, calling yourself misunderstood is easier than risking another disappointment, pretending you don't care is easier than admitting you wish someone would simply ask how you're doing. But growth begins exactly where those excuses end. So if your lack of friends has been, even in part, self-protection dressed up as independence, don't judge yourself for it. Don't carry shame. Every human being develops defenses after pain. The Stoic path isn't about condemning those defenses. It is about recognizing them clearly and deciding whether they still serve the person you want to become. Maybe this week your courage looks very small. Maybe it's sending one message you've been postponing. Maybe it's accepting an invitation instead of making an excuse. Maybe it's calling someone you haven't spoken to in months. Maybe it's simply allowing yourself to believe that not everyone you meet is destined to disappoint you. Small actions reshape identity far more than dramatic promises ever will. Remember, the strongest walls are not destroyed in a single day. They crack one choice at a time, one conversation, one act of courage, one moment of vulnerability. So, let me leave you with one final question. What's one small step toward connection you've been avoiding? You don't have to take it today. You don't have to solve your loneliness overnight. But simply naming that step, even in the comments below, is the first crack in the wall you've spent years building. And sometimes, that first crack is where an entirely different life begins. There's a concept the Stoics return to again and again, one of the most powerful ideas ever written about the human mind. They called it the inner citadel. Imagine a fortress built not from stone but from character. A place within you that no external circumstance, not rejection, not betrayal, not failure, not loneliness, can completely destroy, provided you've taken the time to build it with patience and deliberate care. The Stoics believed that every human being carries the possibility of such a fortress inside themselves. But like every fortress, it isn't built overnight. It is constructed slowly, brick by brick, choice by choice, hardship by hardship. Every disappointment becomes another stone. Every setback becomes another wall. Every moment you refuse to surrender your peace to circumstances strengthens its foundation. Marcus Aurelius understood this better than almost anyone in history. He wasn't writing his reflections from a quiet monastery or a peaceful countryside. He was the emperor of the greatest empire on earth during one of its darkest chapters. His reign was surrounded by plague, endless war, political betrayal, personal grief, and responsibilities that would have crushed most people. He buried children. He watched trusted allies fail him. He carried the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. Yet, amid all of that chaos, he filled the pages of his journal with some of the calmest reflections humanity has ever known. Why? Not because his world was peaceful, but because his inner world had become stronger than the storm surrounding it. His peace wasn't dependent on events becoming easier. It came from building a mind that refused to collapse every time life became difficult. And perhaps that's the deepest answer to the question this video began with. The lack of friends does not mean you're unworthy of love. It does not mean you're destined to spend your life alone. It does not clear's throat mean that something is fundamentally broken inside you. Those are stories loneliness whispers when it has been left alone with your thoughts for too long. But loneliness is not always telling the truth. What your current season can mean, if you choose to see it differently, is that life has quietly handed you something incredibly rare, an opportunity. Not the opportunity you would have chosen, not the one you asked for, but one that has shaped some of the strongest human beings who have ever lived. An opportunity to build your inner citadel before the world gives you people to lean on. Most people never receive this chance. They move continuously from one source of identity to another, from family to school, from friendships to relationships, from workplaces to social circles, rarely spending enough time alone to discover who they actually are without constant validation. Their confidence is borrowed. Their identity is borrowed. Their happiness depends on voices outside themselves. And then, one day, life inevitably changes. A relationship ends. A loved one dies, children move away, friends become strangers, careers disappear, health declines. Distance grows, circumstances shift, because sooner or later solitude visits every single person. Sometimes through death, sometimes through divorce, sometimes through betrayal, sometimes through nothing more dramatic than time itself. And when that day arrives, many discover they never built a foundation strong enough to stand on their own. Without the noise of other people, they no longer know who they are. They crumble, not because solitude is cruel, but because they never learned how to live beside it. But you are building that foundation now earlier than most. While it's uncomfortable, while it feels unfair, while every quiet evening asks difficult questions, every day you spend learning to be at peace with yourself is another stone placed into your inner fortress. Every moment you choose growth over bitterness strengthens walls that no future disappointment can easily break. It hurts, of course it hurts. Anything worth building usually does, but pain during construction is very different from collapse after neglect. One creates strength, the other reveals its absence. That is why this season of your life may not be a curse at all. Strange as it sounds, it may actually be your greatest advantage. A head start that many people won't recognize until much later in life. Seneca captured this beautifully when he wrote that the wise person is self-sufficient. Notice what he did not say. He did not say the wise person rejects friendship. He did not say love is unnecessary. He did not suggest isolation is the highest virtue. The Stoics deeply valued friendship. What Seneca meant was something far more profound. The wise person enjoys friendship without becoming dependent upon it. They welcome love without making it the source of their worth. They appreciate companionship without surrendering their identity to it. Because there is an enormous difference between wanting connection and needing it to feel complete. Wanting connection is beautifully human, it is healthy, it is natural. It reminds us that we belong to one another, but needing another person's approval just to believe you have value. That is a quiet form of self-abandonment. It is handing your sense of worth to people who may or may not choose to carry it. And that is far too heavy a burden to place on anyone. So here's the reframe, simple, clear, and perhaps life-changing. The lack of friends does not mean you're unlovable. It does not mean you've been forgotten. It does not mean your story is somehow less meaningful than everyone else's. It may simply mean you've been placed on an unusually direct path towards self-reliance. The one virtue the Stoics believed could never truly be taken away once it had been earned. Because money can disappear, health can decline, status can vanish, relationships can change, even entire empires can fall. But a well-built character remains. An inner citadel cannot be stolen. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be borrowed. It can only be built, and once it's built, it becomes home wherever life takes you. So if something you've heard today has eased the weight on your chest even slightly, if for the first time in a long while, your loneliness feels less like a life sentence and more like a season of preparation, then let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I want you to remember this before you leave. You are far less alone than silence has convinced you to believe. Sometimes the strongest people in the room are simply standing quietly beside one another, without realizing they're fighting the very same battle. None of this is an argument for permanent isolation. The Stoics were never advocates of a lonely life cut off from humanity. They did not glorify isolation for its own sake, nor did they believe that wisdom meant becoming emotionally unreachable. Solitude in Stoicism was never the destination. It was a season, a place of preparation, reflection, and growth before returning to the world with greater clarity. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that human beings are born for one another. Just as the hands work together, just as the feet move in harmony, just as the upper and lower rows of teeth exist to serve a common purpose, so too are people designed by nature to live in cooperation, to reject every relationship, to permanently withdraw from every human bond, would not have been a sign of strength in his eyes. It would have been a rejection of our own nature. The Stoics understood something that modern culture often forgets. Strength and connection are not opposites. Self-reliance and love are not enemies. You can possess an unshakable inner life while still deeply appreciating the people who walk beside you. In fact, the stronger your inner foundation becomes, the healthier your relationships are likely to be, because the goal was never to become someone who needs no one. The goal was to become someone so internally whole that when friendship arrives, it becomes a gift instead of a rescue. When love enters your life, it becomes an addition rather than a replacement for your identity. When companionship finds you, it enriches an already meaningful existence instead of carrying the impossible burden of creating one. That distinction changes everything. People who seek relationships to escape themselves often become trapped inside them. They tolerate disrespect because they fear being alone. They ignore red flags because loneliness feels even more frightening. They silence their opinions to avoid rejection. They slowly disappear inside relationships they were convinced would finally complete them. But someone who has learned to stand comfortably in their own company enters relationships differently. They choose rather than cling. They appreciate rather than possess. They love without losing themselves. And perhaps that is one of the greatest forms of freedom the Stoics ever pointed toward. So what does that look like in ordinary life? It looks surprisingly simple. Not easy, but simple. You control your own honesty. Even when pretending to be someone else feels safer. Even when performing a version of yourself seems more likely to earn approval, real connection cannot grow around a mask. Eventually, every performance becomes exhausting. Authenticity may attract fewer people, but it attracts the right ones. You control whether you reach out first, not because you're guaranteed a reply, not because every invitation will be accepted, but because courage is measured by action, not outcome. One unanswered message does not define your worth. One awkward conversation does not define your future. One rejection is simply one person's decision, not a universal judgment of your value. You control how you treat the few people who genuinely remain in your life. The Stoics never admired having hundreds of shallow acquaintances. They admired loyalty, integrity, presence. To give someone your full attention in a distracted world has become an extraordinary act. To listen without waiting for your turn to speak, to remember what matters to another person, to keep your word. To remain consistent. These quiet habits build friendships that last far longer than charm ever could. And perhaps most importantly, you control the conversation taking place inside your own mind, especially during the quiet hours. Those moments when no notifications arrive, when no one is sitting beside you, when the room is silent enough that your thoughts begin speaking louder than the world. Be careful there, because loneliness often invents stories that sound convincing. It whispers that everyone else belongs somewhere except you. It tells you that your value depends upon who chooses you. It convinces you that silence is proof you've been forgotten. The Stoics would urge you not to believe every thought simply because it appears in your mind. Examine it. Challenge it. Ask whether it reflects reality or merely fear wearing the voice of certainty. Speak to yourself with the same fairness you would offer someone you deeply care about, because the relationship you have with yourself quietly shapes every other relationship you will ever build. So, build your inner citadel first, strengthen it patiently, not to shut the world out, but so the world can enter without destroying your peace. Let your character become solid enough that disappointment cannot collapse it. Let your confidence grow roots deeper than other people's opinions. Let your worth become something you carry inside, rather than something you constantly search for outside yourself. And then, from that stronger place, not from desperation, not from emptiness, not from fear, not from the scarcity mindset that has damaged so many relationships throughout history, extend your hand toward others once again. Allow yourself to trust again. Allow yourself to care again. Allow yourself to be seen again, not because you need someone to complete you, but because you finally have something complete to share. That is the Stoic path through loneliness, not pretending the pain doesn't exist, not numbing yourself until you no longer care, not hiding from humanity forever, but accepting solitude as a season of construction, a quiet period where character is shaped, courage is strengthened, and identity is built from the inside out. And when that season has done its work, you return to the world, not as someone begging to be chosen, not as someone terrified of being abandoned, but as someone who can finally choose connection freely, love generously, and walk beside others without ever needing to lose themselves in the process. Because that is the paradox the Stoics understood centuries ago. The people most capable of forming healthy relationships are often the very people who have already learned how to stand peacefully on their own. So, what does the lack of friends actually mean? It does not mean you are broken. It does not mean you are destined for permanent isolation. It does not mean the years you spent without a crowd around you were wasted years. It means you have been handed, whether you asked for it or not, the raw material the Stoics considered priceless. Time alone with your own character, with no audience to perform for and no crowd to hide inside. Marcus Aurelius built an inner citadel while governing an empire on fire. Seneca turned solitude into a forge. Epictetus, who had every reason to believe he was worth nothing, became the teacher of emperors. None of them got there by accident. They got there by doing exactly what you're doing right now, sitting with the discomfort, asking the hard questions, and refusing to accept the easy, false story that quiet years equal a wasted life. Wherever you are tonight, in a packed house that still feels empty, or in true silence with no one to call, the same path is open to you. Build the fortress, then choose deliberately who deserves to stand inside its walls with you. If this video gave you even a small shift in how you see your own solitude, that's exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe if you want more of this practical ancient wisdom for the problems nobody else is talking about plainly. Like the video if it spoke to something real. And before you go, tell me in the comments what's one thing you're going to build in this season of quiet that your future self will thank you for. Until next time, stay grounded, stay clear-headed, and remember the obstacle is the way.